They live in a world that cools and lengthens its winters, a planet entering the mid-Pleistocene transition, where the pace of ice ages slows from brisk 41,000-year pulses to broader, heavier 100,000-year swings, and the change settles like a long breath over continents and seas as ice sheets thicken. Sea level falls and rises by tens of meters, and the winds grow drier across open ground. In this broadening rhythm, the stage is set for scarcity dispersal and a fragile continuity of human life. The deep ocean bears witness first stacking layers of oxygen isotopes that quietly record ice growth and melt. In those layers, the amplitude of glacial cycles increases, a signature of colder baselines, and more persistent ice and currents reorganize so that heat moves differently between hemispheres, lifting and lowering the edges of habitability along coasts and inland basins. Across the northern hemisphere, expanding ice sheets push southward in step with the new cycles, kilometer-thick domes of snow turned stone altering jet streams and storm tracks. To the south, deserts and semi-arid belts widen, dust travels farther, and downwind plateaus bury themselves under loess that tells of stronger winters and longer dry seasons. On the Chinese Loess Plateau, grain sizes coarsen in these intervals, a quieter detail that speaks of more forceful winds, while in the Mediterranean and eastern Africa lakes surge and vanish in alternation, leaving shorelines that rise and fall like rings inside an old tree. In the Rift Valley, basins deepen and split, hydrothermal fields flare and fade, and seasonal rivers braid themselves into the dust. The planet's orbital cycles, eccentricity, obliquity, and precession, continue their slow dance. But feedbacks within ice rock, ocean, and carbon push the climate system toward longer, more extreme winters. And yet the precise cause of this transition remains unsettled. A scientific question kept open by the interplay of regolith removal beneath ice sheets, shifts in deep ocean ventilation, and the slow drawdown and variability of atmospheric carbon dioxide. In this setting, ancestral humans move when the rains fail and pause when they return. They keep to the edges of water, to springs that hold on through the dry months, to marshes that do not fully vanish, and to wooded gullies where edible roots persist under fallen leaves. They hold stone in hand, the Acheulean bifaces that spread across Africa and beyond, long before this cooling accelerates tools that remain steady, companions even as habitats change. A shaped edge gives meat tubers and fibers with less waste, and that economy matters more with each leaner season. They watch the skies for the path of clouds and for the sharp clarity that means dust on the wind, and they learn the breaths of their landscapes, the rift's tectonic warmth, the sea's tidal gifts, when coastlines step outward during glacial lows, the high-ground breezes that keep mosquitoes at a tolerable distance when valley floods recede. Fires light here and there, some born from lightning strikes in storms that arrive late and leave early. Within caves and on riverbanks, the first steady glow of controlled fire likely appears during this wider window. Though the timing remains debated and the evidence is scattered, charred bone in deep cave sediments at wonderwork, around 1 million years ago, fire-marked plant remains and spatial patterning at Gesher Benot Yaakov, near 780,000 years ago, each site a careful clue rather than a final statement. Where fire holds a place, nights lengthen in human time rather than planetary time. Warmth extends the evening's tasks. Embers harden wooden tips and soften tough foods. Smoke keeps biting insects at bay, and the memory of light becomes a resource that can be carried, nursed, and shared. Yet even the best stones dull, the brightest sparks fail, and the rains may not return when they are due. Glacial intensification narrows growing seasons, compresses animal ranges, and lengthens the distances between predictable resources, and in these stretched landscapes, small populations risk failing to find one another. Along coasts, drop in sea level exposes broad shelves, low plains laced with tidal creeks and lagoons. These are temporary continents where shellfish, stranded pools, and beach-cast kelp create mosaics of food. But they are also places the ocean will reclaim when interglacials swell again, leaving little trace of any camp that once stood on the drowned flats. Inland elephants, horses, and antelope shift their routes with the grasses, and carnivores follow. People learn to read hoof marks on indurated surfaces and to time their movements to springs that refill after the first storms, because a day too early is hunger and a day too late is emptiness. The magnetic field approaches a reversal within this broad period, the Matuyama to Brunhes switch, that will soon mark a line in global strata and help future minds anchor their timelines. The reversal itself changes little in daily life, but it becomes a planetary bookmark that later aligns caves, lavas, and ocean cores with a shared clock. The world's scale presses gently into every choice. Glaciers raise global albedo and cool the tropics by degrees that still alter tree lines and rainfall. Ocean gateways modulate heat and salt. Monsoons arrive less reliably, and the margin where forest grades into savanna migrates like a frontier watched by birds and people alike. In this evolving pattern, the distribution of fresh water governs where napped flakes accumulate and where they do not. A cluster of hand axes at a spring bed that persists through 2 dry seasons indicates a node of survival, while gaps on nearby ridges imply long crossings or times when no one passes. The fossil record through part of this era grows thin and quiet, less a story of disappearance than of preservation biases and shifting taphonomic windows. Yet the quiet itself matters, because it means that many faces and gestures leave no mark we can now hold. The unresolved heart of this opening section is a simple question with consequences that extend through all later chapters. Why do the cycles change in this way, and how tightly do they bind human fortunes? The evidence shows coincidence and plausible links. Colder baselines, lengthened droughts, altered ecosystems. But the exact chain from planetary oscillation to population stress remains a careful area of study. The lesser-known detail, folded into dust and sediment, is that particle sizes in wind-blown deposits and the chemistry of ocean microfossils together register not just colder times, but different wind fields and nutrient deliveries, subtle signals that match the emerging pattern of longer, harsher glacials and brief, generous interglacials. The fact that guides the story is secure during the mid-Pleistocene transition, Earth's predominant glacial rhythm, shifts from 41,000-year cycles tied to tilt toward longer 100,000-year cycles with larger ice volumes and greater sea level range, a structural change in climate pacing that frames the conditions in which small human groups endure. Nights remain long and rivers tick downward as seasons pass, then rise in sharp floods when the monsoon finds its path for a year or two. Stars provide the only fixed dome as shorelines and lake margins walk back and forth on the ground, and people learn patience as a tool alongside stone. Scale settles into the narrative as numbers behind the silent sea level may fall by 100 meters. At glacial peaks, coastlines step outward by days walking, and the difference between a persistent spring and a vanished one can be measured in only a few meters of groundwater. Within this opening scene, nothing dramatic needs to occur. The planet simply holds to its new rhythm, and in that rhythm, ancestral humans adjust with minimal means and careful memory, keeping to water, keeping to edges, keeping their knowledge of fire where they can, and preparing without knowing it for the long narrowing to come. Genetic evidence drawn from modern and ancient genomes points backward into this dim chapter, suggesting that during the span between roughly 930,000 and 813,000 years ago, the ancestral human population shrinks to a precarious level of fewer than 1,300 breeding individuals, a number so small that it approaches the threshold of irreversible loss. In this long bottleneck, the continuity of humanity narrows to a thread. The discovery comes not from fossils alone, but from the silent record carried inside the DNA of living humans, where patterns of variation reveal both deep time scales and sudden constrictions, and through advanced modeling of coalescent histories, geneticists infer that a dramatic reduction occurred during the mid-Pleistocene transition lasting for over 100,000 years, a period that overlaps with the harshest phases of climate instability. The fact itself is stark. The human lineage, or at least the population ancestral to Homo sapiens and our closest relatives, nearly disappears, leaving only a few hundred small groups scattered across Africa and perhaps neighboring regions separated by vast stretches of uninhabitable terrain. Yet even as genetic models outline this narrow passage, the fossil record remains sparse, and the gap between bone and molecule is wide. This unresolved tension becomes one of the mysteries: why so few physical traces remain, and why the genomes so consistently point to crisis. Archaeological layers from this interval are often eroded, buried or lost beneath younger deposits, and where sites do exist, they are fragmentary, their artifacts washed from ancient contexts or found as isolated tools without associated remains. So the silence in stone echoes the silence in genes. Climate models suggest that prolonged glacial periods during this time drive severe cooling, stronger monsoon failures, and long megadroughts across Africa, Asia, and Europe. Rainfall contracts, grasslands desiccate, and forests retreat, creating islands of survival where springs, lakes, or coastal zones resist the wider drying. In such landscapes, groups of humans dwindle not from a single catastrophic event, but from the drawn-out stress of low birth rates, high mortality, and separation by distance, until the effective population size shrinks to levels that would leave lasting genetic signatures visible today. The lesser-known detail is that within this bottleneck, genes linked to brain development and immunity show evidence of selection, suggesting that even in near extinction, subtle shifts in physiology and adaptation occur, shaping traits that will echo through later human evolution. These signals are faint but measurable, a reminder that evolution continues, even when numbers fall to dangerous lows. Mystery surrounds where these few surviving groups live. Hypotheses range from refugia along East African rift lakes that held water, when surrounding basins dried to coastal margins, where shellfish and marine plants offered stable food to highland pockets, where cooler climates and perennial springs created green havens. Yet no single location has been proven, and perhaps survival depended on several regions linked by occasional gene flow. The planetary scale observation is clear during this interval. Earth's climate is not only colder but also more variable, with glacial and interglacial swings deepening, carbon dioxide fluctuating sharply, and ocean currents reorganizing in ways that affect rainfall across continents. The bottleneck is not merely a local accident, but a reflection of global systems shifting into a new mode. In Europe, ice sheets advance and retreat, scouring basins that later fill with loess and lakes. In Asia, deserts widen, winds strengthen, and dust storms carry sediments far into the Pacific. In Africa, rivers contract and many basins become salt flats, while in the southern oceans, nutrient cycles alter productivity, changing the food web from plankton upward, a chain of shifts that indirectly influences terrestrial survival. Humans at this time are not alone. Other hominin species share the wider landscape, from Homo erectus in Asia to possible early precursors of Denisovans or Neanderthals in Eurasia, but which groups pass through the bottleneck and which vanish remains unresolved. Fossils like those at Atapuerca in Spain and Gongwangling in China fall near this time frame, yet the lineages they represent may not contribute directly to modern humans, underscoring how the bottleneck complicates the genealogy of Homo. The scale of the reduction is sobering, from potentially tens of thousands or more, before the contraction down to fewer than 2,000 effective individuals for more than 100,000 years, a span longer than the entire existence of many later civilizations. A reminder that survival is measured not only in numbers, but in continuity across deep time. During this bottleneck, tools remained simple, dominated by Acheulean hand axes and cleavers, artifacts of continuity rather than innovation. Change in stone technology is gradual, suggesting that cultural transmission persists even in small groups, an anchor of shared knowledge carried across generations despite their isolation. Fire, if controlled during this period, would provide a crucial buffer against the cold and the dry, yet the evidence remains debated, and the uncertainty adds weight to the mystery. Did these fragile groups master fire early enough to aid survival? Or did they endure with only stone and shelter until fire use became widespread? Later, geneticists debate the causes as well as the consequences. Some suggest that the bottleneck corresponds to speciation within Homo, a split that will eventually yield the lineages leading to sapiens, Neanderthals, and Denisovans, while others caution that the signal may reflect population structure rather than absolute numbers, with humans scattered in small, semi-isolated groups that together form a genetic pattern of reduction. Either way, the result is the same: humanity emerges from this long corridor, reduced and reshaped, bearing the marks of near loss in every cell. The uncertainty lies also in what was lost: entire cultural traditions. Regional tool styles or even early symbolic behaviors may have flickered out without leaving trace, erased by time and by the narrowness of survival, so that later evidence gives no hint of their existence. Across this silence, the planet continues its own rhythm: glaciers waxing and waning, seas stepping back and forth across continental shelves, winds carrying dust and pollen that archive the cycles in sediments we read today. Earth holds its memory even when humans nearly do not. Within this frame, the genetic bottleneck is not just a biological fact, but a planetary story, showing how shifts in orbital pacing, atmospheric chemistry, and ocean circulation can press a species to the brink. And yet, from within fewer than 1,300 breeding individuals, the lineage continues, fragile but unbroken, a thread that stretches forward to encompass every human who follows a scale of survival, both humbling and immense. The quiet of this section is the quiet of continuity against odds, a reminder that our species' distant ancestors endured not in abundance but in scarcity, not in dominance but in persistence, holding on in places we can only partially reconstruct, and leaving to us the mystery of how they succeeded in crossing a bottleneck that almost ended their story. As the bottleneck unfolds, the world outside these small human groups is shaped by vast swings of ice, dryness, and shifting skies. The atmosphere and oceans coupling in ways that amplify scarcity across continents. During this phase of the mid-Pleistocene, the glacial cycles deepen and lengthen, and with them, the extent of polar ice and the severity of aridity in the tropics. Ice sheets grow in North America and Eurasia, their margins pushing further south, lowering global sea level by more than 100 meters at times, exposing continental shelves and altering coastlines so thoroughly that entire landscapes vanish beneath water in interglacial rebound. With these changes, rainfall belts migrate, monsoon systems weaken, and deserts expand across the Sahara, Arabia, and Central Asia, leaving vast tracts of land uninhabitable for long stretches. Inland lakes shrink or vanish entirely, leaving salt pans and dry beds that testify to alternating phases of abundance and collapse. The climate does not settle into steady cold alone. Rather, it wavers between short, intense interglacials and long glaciations, a pattern that strains plants, animals, and humans alike. The fossil record from these centuries shows pulses of faunal turnover, with large mammals adapting to steppe conditions, while others retreat or go extinct. Proboscideans, equids, and bovids roam in shifting herds, but their ranges contract with drought, and predators adjust accordingly, tightening the competition for meat. For humans, These pressures create long corridors of movement, forcing bands to walk farther between reliable waterholes, often into landscapes scarred by dust storms or frozen ground. Dust layers in marine cores from off Africa and China grow thicker during these glacial intervals, reflecting not only stronger winds but also the stripping of soils from arid land, a subtle detail that confirms the planet's deepening dryness and the environmental instability confronting human groups. Against this backdrop, genetic data suggesting a bottleneck gains context. The world itself is hostile, and only isolated refuges would allow survival through cycles of scarcity. One unresolved mystery is the degree to which climate alone accounts for the reduction in human numbers. Some scholars argue that volcanic events or ecological competition with other hominins might have played roles. But the dominant factor appears to be the planetary-scale reorganization of climate rhythms, which diminish habitable zones until only fragments remain. The pace of orbital forcing interacts with ice sheet feedbacks to produce a new mode of glaciation, and while Earth's tilt and orbit drive the cycles, feedbacks in carbon dioxide and albedo magnify them, bringing longer droughts, colder peaks, and harsher seasonality. Humans, bound to water and to the movement of prey, experience these changes as years of unreliable rainfall and landscapes that shift within a lifetime. In Africa, evidence from paleolakes shows repeated transgressions and regressions. Lake Victoria, Lake Turkana, and others expand dramatically during pluvial phases only to shrink or disappear when monsoons fail, leaving behind beach ridges and fossilized fish as markers of vanished abundance. These oscillations transform the Rift Valley into a corridor of shifting habitability, sometimes a lush mosaic of lakes and wetlands, sometimes a dry expanse where survival depends on scattered springs. The planetary observation is sobering. Climate swings during this interval are not local or short-term, but global and systemic, tied to ocean circulation, greenhouse gases, and ice volume, showing the tight coupling of Earth's systems. In Europe and Asia, permafrost expands southward, cold steppes dominate, and forest belts retract. In Africa, woodland and savanna give way to desert margins, reducing the diversity of edible plants and game. For small human populations already reduced to precarious numbers, each contraction of habitat means fewer opportunities to meet and exchange genes, compounding the bottleneck's severity. Archaeological evidence shows that stone tool traditions persist despite environmental stress. Acheulean handaxes appear across Africa, Europe, and Asia, sometimes in association with animal bones, bearing cut marks suggesting persistence of hunting and scavenging practices even in difficult times. Yet gaps remain long stretches, with few or no sites, a silence that may reflect both preservation bias and true demographic collapse. The lesser-known detail is that these silences align with known phases of aridity recorded in deep-sea cores, indicating that human absence from the record may coincide with genuine declines in population size and occupation intensity. Mystery lingers in the relationship between humans and other hominins. During these centuries, Homo erectus persists in Asia, and possible ancestors of Denisovans and Neanderthals occupy parts of Eurasia. But how interactions unfolded is unknown. Did these groups compete for scarce refuges, or were they separated by distance into isolated ecological niches? The absence of direct evidence leaves the question open, though genetics suggest later interbreeding, meaning that some level of contact across bottleneck populations may have occurred. The planetary scale can be measured in layers. Laos, in China, thickens with glacial winds, marine sediments, record pulses of ice-rafted debris, speleothems in caves, register shifts in rainfall and ice cores. Though from younger epochs, confirm the kind of variability that must have defined the world at this earlier time. Against this immensity, humans survive at scales of a few hundred in refugia, each group representing a fragile thread in the tapestry of continuity. Fires, if managed, would mitigate some of the cold and allow exploitation of new foods, yet the scarcity of clear evidence before 800,000 years ago means that the story remains unresolved, leaving open whether most groups relied on fire during the harshest intervals or endured without it. The bottleneck itself, revealed through genetics, is measured in effective population size, but behind that abstraction lie the lived realities of drought, hunger dispersal, and occasional local abundance when rains return. Even then, the abundance is temporary. Monsoon intensification might last a few centuries. Lakes swell, vegetation spreads, and animals return only for the system to reverse when orbital pacing shifts again. For the human lineage, the challenge is persistence through these oscillations, with stone tools as continuity, landscape knowledge as inheritance, and cooperation within small groups as a necessity. The unresolved mystery remains whether climate alone drove the bottleneck, but the evidence points strongly to the combined effects of glacial lengthening aridity and ecosystem contraction as the primary causes. The planetary observation underlines the magnitude shifts in orbital cycles reshape rainfall across continents, glaciers reshape sea level across oceans, and humans feel those planetary rhythms as the difference between life and disappearance. The detail of dust particle size coarser in glacial intervals underscores how wind and soil record the intensification of the climate system, providing subtle confirmation of the pressures endured. The fact stands firm. The mid-Pleistocene climate swings colder and longer than before imposed severe ecological stress, and within that stress, human populations contracted dramatically. The silence in the record reflects the fragility of those who endured their traces thin against the scale of planetary change. This section closes with the understanding that the skies themselves shift. Monsoons weaken deserts. Spread and glaciers advance, binding human fate to cycles larger than any single species, and in that binding lies the narrowing of our lineage to near extinction. In a world dominated by cold phases and relentless aridity, human survival depends upon fragile refuges, small landscapes where water persists and food remains accessible even when surrounding regions collapse into desert or tundra. These refuges are not many, and their precise locations are uncertain. Yet, the logic of survival points to a handful of likely candidates across Africa and perhaps parts of Eurasia. The East African Rift Valley stands as one of the strongest possibilities, for even during prolonged droughts, its tectonic depressions host springs fed from deep groundwater, while volcanic soils trap moisture and support vegetation when the wider savanna browns to dust. Lakes such as Turkana, though they rise and fall dramatically, still provide occasional shorelines with fish, mollusks, and reeds resources that would have supported small human groups when grazing animals withdrew. To the south, basins in what is now Botswana and South Africa hold evidence of paleolakes that may have lingered through dry intervals, their fluctuating levels, leaving sedimentary records of alternation between wet abundance and arid contraction. Along coastal margins, especially in East Africa and perhaps the Arabian Peninsula, marine resources may have provided an additional buffer, as tidal zones can yield shellfish and stranded fish even when inland droughts worsen. Such habitats are difficult to trace archaeologically because sea level changes have drowned most ancient shorelines, but the possibility of coastal refugia remains a strong hypothesis. The lesser-known detail lies in the evidence of ancient DNA itself. Signals of prolonged small population size suggest not a single refuge, but several scattered pockets of survival, each isolated for long stretches, connected only by rare dispersals that allowed limited gene flow and prevented total isolation. The unresolved mystery is the exact geography of these refuges. Despite decades of fossil searching, no site yet reveals a continuous record through the entire bottleneck interval, leaving us to infer survival zones indirectly from climatic models, sediment cores, and genetic reconstructions. Still, the logic of ecological refugia is clear. where perennial water intersects with diverse food sources, their survival becomes possible even if the group numbers only in the hundreds. These refuges shape not just biology but culture, for knowledge of which spring holds longest, which tree fruits late in the season, and which coastline yields predictable shellfish becomes the difference between continuity and disappearance. The scale of planetary change presses against these small landscapes. Glaciers wax in the north, deserts spread in the tropics, ocean circulation patterns alter monsoons, and yet within a few green valleys, caves or shorelines, the lineage of humanity persists. Archaeological hints support this inference. At Olorgesailie in Kenya, stone tools show long sequences of use, suggesting repeated occupation even as lake levels shifted. Though the record is incomplete, the persistence of artifacts implies a landscape that humans returned to, perhaps one of the refugees that carried them through lean times. At Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, traces of occupation and fire use appear near 1 million years ago, hinting at long continuity in a region buffered by karst springs and varied topography. In these refuges, hand axes remain the mainstay, their forms stable across thousands of generations, a continuity that reflects both the conservative nature of small populations and the reliable utility of a sharp bifacial edge. Fire, if controlled in some refuges, would extend survival by allowing cooking of tubers and roots, safer nights, and adaptation to colder conditions. Yet the evidence remains partial, and the mystery of when fire mastery truly becomes widespread persists. The planetary scale observation here is that while the majority of Earth becomes harsher, certain ecological niches resist total collapse, maintaining moisture, shade, and edible resources. The distribution of these niches is patchy, but their persistence allows human survival where broad landscapes fail. On a global scale, these refugia parallel those seen in other species during glaciation's. Plants and animals retreat into small pockets of favorable climate, later expanding outward when conditions improve, a dynamic mirrored in human survival. In genetic terms, these refuges explain the structure of the bottleneck. Each refuge contains only a small number of breeding individuals, and the occasional mixing between refugees maintains a minimal level of diversity. Yet the small numbers amplify the effects of genetic drift, reducing variation and leaving signatures that persist to the present. The lesser-known implication is that many lineages, cultural and biological, may have vanished in refuges that ultimately failed. Groups that held on for centuries may leave no descendants if their valley dried or their shoreline flooded. What survives is not necessarily the most numerous at the time, but the most fortunate in persistence. The fact guiding this section is clear genetic studies using advanced models, including approaches such as the Fitcole method, show that human effective population size dropped below 1/300 breeding individuals during this long interval, consistent with survival in only a few refuges worldwide. Against this background, the silence in the fossil record becomes less surprising, for small groups leave few traces, and many refuges lie in regions where later geology erased or drowned their remains. Mystery, however, continues to animate research. Whether survival depended primarily on Rift Valley lakes, coastal resources, or southern African refuges remains unsettled, with each hypothesis carrying supporting evidence but no definitive proof. At the planetary scale, orbital cycles dictate glaciation. Ice sheets modulate sea level, and shifting currents alter rainfall, producing a cascade that narrows human habitats to mere fragments. The contrast is stark. Earth as a whole undergoes vast systemic reorganization, while humans endure in landscapes measured in kilometers rather than continents, tied to a spring or a tidal zone. Yet from such narrow refuges, the lineage endures, passing through more than 100,000 years of scarcity. The enduring presence of Acheulean tools reflects continuity in knowledge across generations. that may number in the hundreds rather than thousands, a fragile but sufficient chain of learning. In each refuge, children learn to strike flakes from stone, to recognize edible roots, to follow tracks, and to keep fire if they have it. The survival of these skills ensures the survival of the group even when numbers fall dangerously low. The lesson written in the genetic record is that human survival does not require abundance. It requires persistence in refuges that buffer against planetary extremes. What remains mysterious is how many refuges there were, how far apart they lay, and how often they exchanged members. The gaps in evidence reflect the fragility of both people and landscapes, yet the fact that any survived at all stands as a testament to adaptation within narrow ecological margins. From this long endurance in fragile refuges emerges the foundation for all later human lineages, a survival that binds our species to springs, caves, coasts, and green valleys that once carried life through the coldest and driest centuries of the mid-Pleistocene. Among the most enduring questions of this long narrowing is the role of fire. For though its traces are faint and contested, the possibility that ancestral humans held light and heat in their hands during the bottleneck alters how we understand survival itself. Fire provides warmth against the deep chill of glacial nights, a means to cook fibrous roots and tough meat protection from predators, and a gathering point that lengthens the human day. Yet the archaeological record for early fire is elusive, consisting of scattered fragments of charcoal-reddened sediments and burnt bone, often difficult to distinguish from natural blazes. One of the most cited pieces of evidence comes from Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, where deposits dating to around 1 million years ago show ash layers deep within the cave, unlikely to have been carried there by wind or surface fires. Microscopic analysis reveals charred plant matter and bone suggesting burning in situ, perhaps the earliest secure sign of hominin control over fire. Another important site is Gesher Benot Yaakov in Israel, where hearth-like concentrations of burned flint and plant remains dated to around 780,000 years ago, indicate repeated use of fire in an open-air context, but that falls later than the heart of the bottleneck. Between these two poles lies uncertainty. Was fire already a mastered tool by 900,000 years ago, or did its controlled use only become widespread after the worst of the bottleneck had passed? The fact remains unresolved, but the potential is profound, because fire would have buffered groups against harsh climates, allowed expansion into colder habitats, and improved nutrition at a time when survival was otherwise tenuous. The lesser-known detail is that some scholars propose that even occasional fire use, not yet mastered but opportunistic, could have offered survival advantages, with groups capturing natural fires and nursing embers for days or weeks before losing them, a fragile control that reflects transition rather than full mastery. This possibility suggests that the role of fire in the bottleneck may not have been universal, but patchy, with some refuges benefiting and others surviving without it. Mystery lies in why evidence of early fire is so scarce, if it was indeed a crucial tool. One explanation is preservation, for ash and charcoal often degrade in open-air contexts, and only caves or waterlogged sites preserve microscopic traces, meaning the absence of evidence may not be evidence of absence. Another possibility is that early fire use was simply rare, emerging in a few groups, but not widespread enough to leave a consistent record. At planetary scale, the appearance of fire in the archaeological record coincides with broader ecological changes. Increased aridity and seasonality would have made natural fires more common, and human groups, encountering these blazes, may have learned to take advantage of them. A co-evolution of environment and culture. Fire also alters landscapes beyond human use, promoting grasses over trees in some ecosystems and changing animal distributions. So even early limited human fire use may have had ecological effects larger than the groups themselves. For small bands of fewer than 100, carrying fire becomes a ritual of continuity, a small flame kept alive through night and rain passed from one hearth to another. Though we cannot reconstruct their practices, the survival of this skill across later prehistory suggests that its origins may reach back into the Bottleneck era. Herculean tools remain alongside this potential innovation, showing that technological continuity persists even as fire use possibly emerges. The contrast between the stability of stone tools and the tentative evidence for fire highlights how uneven human innovation can be, with some technologies holding steady for hundreds of thousands of years, while others appear gradually and sporadically. The fact central to this section is that multiple sites near or within the Bottleneck period show evidence consistent with early fire use, though none provide definitive proof of widespread control. The lesser-known observation is that burned flints at Gesher Benot Yaakov occur alongside plant remains such as waternuts and olives, suggesting that fire was used not only for warmth but also for processing plant foods, an early sign of the nutritional role of heat. The unresolved mystery is whether fire truly served as a lifeline during the Bottleneck, or whether humans endured its harshest centuries without it mastering fire only afterward. At planetary scale, the appearance of fire use must be seen against the backdrop of increasing climate instability, where fire frequency rises naturally due to vegetation stress and lightning storms, offering more opportunities for humans to interact with flames. The scale reference is humbling, if fewer than 1,300 breeding individuals survived the Bottleneck. The number of fires they may have collectively maintained at any one time could be counted in dozens rather than thousands. A small constellation of flames scattered across a vast and often dark planet. Yet those fires, however few, carry immense weight in human history, representing the first deliberate harnessing of an elemental force that shapes ecosystems and societies for the rest of prehistory and beyond. The quiet endurance of fire echoes the endurance of humans themselves, fragile, sometimes extinguished, sometimes reignited, always dependent on careful tending. This fragility mirrors the genetic bottleneck where survival hangs on narrow margins, continuity preserved by persistence more than abundance. From this perspective, the story of fire is less about dramatic discovery and more about slow, uncertain practice, a learning process that unfolds across thousands of years, overlapping with the bottleneck that nearly ended us. The fact that later humans universally master fire suggests that somewhere in one or several refuges, the flame was kept alive long enough to become embedded in human tradition, surviving the bottleneck as surely as the genes of those who carried it. The mystery remains how early, how widespread, and how reliable that mastery was. But the possibility alone shapes our understanding of how fragile groups survived in landscapes dominated by cold dryness and scarcity. In this section, the light of fire stands as both evidence and symbol of continuity through hardship, illuminating the narrow path that humanity walked through its deepest genetic crisis. Through the long narrowing of the bottleneck, one tool tradition remains constant across landscapes and generations. The Herculean, with its characteristic hand axes, cleavers, and large cutting tools carried in the hands of small human groups as they move between refuges and across changing ecologies. The Herculean begins nearly 1.7 million years ago and persists well past the bottleneck, spanning more than 1 million years of human history, making it the longest-lasting technological tradition known. During the bottleneck period, its continuity becomes not just a cultural marker, but a lifeline, for the reliability of a bifacial edge ensures survival when resources are scarce. These tools are versatile, suited for butchering carcasses, digging tubers, scraping hides, and working wood, and in the absence of complex innovation, their persistence reflects the stability needed in a time of demographic fragility. Archaeological sites across Africa, Europe, and Asia preserve Herculean assemblages through this interval, often associated with animal bones showing cut marks, evidence that even in small numbers, humans maintain a tradition of butchering and scavenging. At sites such as Olorgesailie in Kenya, Hand axes appear in thick sequences spanning hundreds of thousands of years, demonstrating that despite environmental instability, the cultural memory of tool-making survives. In other regions like Konso in Ethiopia or Bose in China, Acheulean tools reveal wide dispersal, suggesting that even as populations shrink, they carry with them the same technological heritage. The fact here is simple but profound. During the Bottleneck, Acheulean technology remains the primary human adaptation, reflecting continuity in knowledge across countless generations. The lesser-known detail is that studies of wear patterns on hand axes show evidence of varied use not only for cutting meat, but for processing plants, woodworking, and hide preparation, underscoring that their value lies in versatility rather than specialization. The unresolved mystery is why Acheulean technology remains so stable for so long. Was it conservatism born of small population size, limiting innovation, or was it simply that the tool was so effective that little improvement was needed? Some scholars argue that demographic contraction during the Bottleneck reduces opportunities for experimentation and cultural transmission of novelties, while others see the stability as evidence that hand axes met nearly all subsistence needs. At planetary scale, Acheulean persistence mirrors the stability of other long-duration systems, such as the rhythm of glacial cycles or the steady pace of orbital forcing. Just as Earth turns on cycles measured in tens of thousands of years, humans continue to shape stone edges in nearly identical ways over equally vast spans. The conservatism of the Acheulean does not imply stagnation. Rather, it highlights the endurance of cultural knowledge through small and scattered populations. A child learns from an elder how to strike flakes, how to center the core, how to thin the edges. And that skill, repeated and shared, becomes the thread that links generations across the Bottleneck. The scale is striking. For more than 100,000 years of near-extinction Acheulean tools provide continuity when little else does. Their simple geometry bridging countless lifespans. Yet the mystery of their distribution remains. For some regions fall silent in the archaeological record during the Bottleneck, leaving gaps where tools must have been used but not preserved. This silence may reflect real absence as populations vanish from certain regions, or it may be a function of preservation bias, with tools lost to erosion, burial, or submergence under later sediments. Still, where they survive, Acheulean tools testify to persistence, a constant human signature, even when genetic evidence tells of near disappearance. The durability of these tools also hints at the role of memory and tradition in small populations. When innovation is risky and mistakes costly, conservatism ensures survival, and a tried-and-true design outlasts experimentation. The fact that Acheulean tools remain nearly unchanged for over 1,000,000 years is not failure, but resilience, a testimony to human adaptation through reliability. The lesser-known observation is that in some sites, Acheulean hand axes are unusually large or finely made, suggesting that beyond utility they may have carried social or symbolic meaning, though such interpretations remain debated. During the Bottleneck, however, their primary value must have been practical, providing the means to process the limited resources that landscapes allowed. At planetary scale, the persistence of Acheulean tools coincides with tectonic and climatic processes that reshape continents and ecosystems. Yet through all this change, humans hold to the same edge. This stability becomes part of the broader story of survival, for in the face of planetary rhythms, too vast to alter, humans maintain continuity through tools, fire when possible, and knowledge of refuges. The unresolved question is whether the Bottleneck slows technological change by reducing population density and cultural exchange, effectively freezing the Acheulean in place, or whether its stability reflects the sufficiency of design. Genetic data suggest reduced effective population size, which would limit innovation, but at the same time, the widespread geographic distribution of Acheulean tools indicates that knowledge continues to spread across continents, even if slowly. This duality remains a puzzle: how small populations maintain global traditions, over such long timescales. The scale reference underscores the enormity. While glaciers wax and wane in 100,000-year cycles, humans chip nearly identical hand axes across Africa, Asia, and Europe, each stroke of stone echoing a tradition that spans continents and millennia. The Acheulean during the Bottleneck is less a sign of technological stagnation than of cultural persistence, a lifeline that ensures survival in the harshest of climates. Fire may or may not have been widespread, refuges may be uncertain, but stone tools endure, connecting humans to the resources of their landscapes and to one another across generations. In this way, the Acheulean becomes the thread through the Bottleneck, a constant in a time of near extinction, and a reminder that survival often depends not on innovation, but on the faithful transmission of knowledge that works. The quiet rhythm of stone against stone, repeated by countless hands, becomes the background sound of humanity's persistence through its deepest crisis. Among the landscapes most often considered as refuges during the Bottleneck, the Rift Valley of East Africa stands out as both lifeline and trap, a region where tectonic activity, fluctuating lakes, and diverse ecologies create alternating abundance and scarcity. The valley stretches for thousands of kilometers, formed by the slow pulling apart of continental crust, and within its depressions lie basins that fill and empty with climate cycles, producing a mosaic of habitats that change within human lifetimes. During wetter intervals, broad lakes expand, attracting grazing animals, fish and waterfowl, providing humans with varied food sources. When monsoons weaken, these same lakes contract into shallow pans or dry altogether, leaving saline flats and dust. For humans living through the Bottleneck, the Rift Valley offers both refuge and danger. A place where water persists longer than in surrounding plateaus, yet also a region where sudden climate swings can turn abundance into desolation. The fact anchoring this section is that sediment cores from Rift Valley lakes, such as Malawi, Turkana, and Tanganyika, preserve records of dramatic fluctuations in depth and chemistry over the last million years, indicating that these basins oscillate between high stands and near desiccation, sometimes within only a few centuries. The lesser-known detail is that within some of these cores, layers of diatoms, microscopic algae, mark brief pluvial phases, when lakes expanded rapidly, suggesting short-lived windows of fertility that may have allowed human groups to grow before contracting again. This dynamic creates cycles of opportunity and crisis, with populations expanding during pluvials and fragmenting during droughts, a rhythm that matches the genetic evidence of prolonged small size, punctuated by slight recoveries. Archaeological sites along the rift reveal Acheulean tools and occasional fossil remains, including those at Olorgesailie, where hand axes are found in association with lake margin sediments, suggesting repeated human presence during times of water availability. Yet gaps in the record align with dry phases when humans may have abandoned the valley or shifted to refuges elsewhere. The unresolved mystery is whether the Rift Valley alone could have supported enough humans to maintain the lineage through the Bottleneck, or whether it functioned as one node in a wider network of refuges scattered across Africa. Some models propose that the valley acted as a corridor, allowing dispersal northward toward the Levant or southward into other parts of Africa during wetter intervals, while isolating groups during droughts. At planetary scale, the rift's significance is tied to broader climatic systems. Monsoons, driven by orbital forcing, determine rainfall, while global ice volume affects sea level and temperature gradients that in turn influence African climate. The rift thus becomes a microcosm of planetary rhythms, where tectonics and climate intersect to shape human survival. Its volcanic landscapes add complexity for eruptions, periodically blanket the region in ash, preserving sites, but also disrupting ecosystems. The scale of these shifts is immense. Lake Malawi, for instance, has fluctuated by hundreds of meters, sometimes shrinking nearly to dryness, while Lake Turkana has expanded to several times its modern size before contracting again. Humans living along these shores must adapt constantly, moving with the water's edge tracking animal herds that come and go, and relying on knowledge of springs and wetlands that persist longest. The valley also provides caves and rock shelters in escarpments, offering protection from weather and predators. And in some of these contexts, traces of occupation survive as charcoal stone tools and occasional bones. Yet the record is thin, and much has been lost to erosion or burial, leaving only fragments of the story. The lesser-known observation is that Rift Valley lakes influence not only human survival, but regional climate itself. For large lakes generate their own rainfall through evaporation, creating localized humidity that sustains vegetation even when surrounding areas are dry. This feedback may have created micro-refugia along lake margins, small green zones where humans and animals persist while the wider savanna contracts. The unresolved mystery remains whether these micro-refugia were stable enough to sustain populations for tens of thousands of years, or whether they served only as temporary havens during shorter dry spells. Genetic evidence implies long-term persistence of small groups, so at least some refugees must have endured through multiple glacial cycles, and the Rift Valley is among the strongest candidates. At planetary scale, these survival zones highlight the importance of geographic diversity in buffering species against climate extremes. Just as forests retract into mountain valleys during glaciations, humans may have retracted into rift basins and coastal shelves, later expanding when conditions improved. The rift's role as both lifeline and trap becomes clear in this pattern: abundance during wet phases, peril during droughts, survival hinging on knowledge of springs, wetlands, and caves. The fact remains secure that human presence in the Rift Valley spans hundreds of thousands of years, documented by tools and fossils, though the exact continuity through the bottleneck is uncertain. The mystery of whether the rift alone could carry humanity through remains open, but its ecological diversity, water resources, and archaeological traces make it central to any reconstruction of survival. The scale reference is striking. While global climate cycles unfold in arcs of tens of thousands of years, humans along the rift measure survival in the distance to water, sometimes a few kilometers walk, determining whether a group endures or collapses. Within this vast planetary framework, the rift functions as a microcosm of human persistence, a place where tectonic, climatic, and biological processes converge to shape the fragile continuity of our lineage. Acheulean tools scattered along ancient shorelines attest to repeated presence, the rhythm of stone against stone, continuing even as lakes rise and fall. Fire, if known here, would have extended survival, further allowing cooked food and protection in caves, though clear evidence remains debated. What is certain is that the Rift Valley, with its shifting lakes and springs, offers one of the most plausible refuges for humanity during its narrowest passage, embodying the delicate balance of opportunity and risk that defines the bottleneck. In its fluctuating waters and preserved sediments, we see both the fragility of human survival and the resilience that allows continuity against overwhelming planetary change. Beyond the inland basins and rift valleys, another possible thread of survival during the bottleneck lies along ancient coastlines, where humans may have found continuity in the resources of the sea. During glacial peaks, sea levels fall by more than 100 meters, exposing vast shelves that today are drowned. These shelves transform into broad coastal plains, crossed by tidal creeks, lagoons, and estuaries, landscapes rich in shellfish, seaweed, stranded fish, and waterfowl. For small groups of humans, these resources offer stability that inland savannas often lack, because tides replenish daily and marine productivity can buffer against drought on land. The fact supporting this idea is that later in prehistory, by at least 160,000 years ago at Pinnacle Point in South Africa, humans clearly exploit shellfish and other coastal foods, and genetic evidence suggests such practices may have deeper roots. Though direct archaeological evidence from the Bottleneck period is almost entirely absent, erased by rising seas during interglacials, the logic of survival points toward coasts as likely refuges when inland resources collapsed. The lesser-known detail is that geological reconstructions of ancient shorelines reveal extensive coastal platforms around Africa and Arabia during glacial lows, many of which would have provided broad habitable zones far larger than modern coasts. These submerged landscapes, sometimes tens of kilometers wide, are invisible today, but may have hosted human groups during critical intervals. Mystery remains in how much humans of this era relied on marine resources. Stone tool assemblages from regions near ancient coasts such as Eritrea and the Horn of Africa hint at possible shoreline occupation, but the absence of preserved shells or middens prevents certainty. If humans did exploit these resources, it may have been opportunistic rather than systematic. Yet even limited use could have provided the steady calories needed for survival. At planetary scale, the role of coastlines underscores the connection between glacial cycles, sea level change, and human survival. As ice sheets grow, sea level drops exposing shelves and creating coastal refugia. As ice melts, seas rise, drowning these habitats and erasing much of the evidence. This cycle repeats across the Bottleneck interval, meaning that humans may have shifted repeatedly between coastal and inland refuges depending on sea level and climate. The scale of this transformation is immense. When sea level falls by 100 meters, the African continental shelf extends outward by tens of thousands of square kilometers, creating new land bridges, lagoons, and estuaries. For small populations, such expansions open corridors of movement and new ecological niches, even if temporarily. Archaeological silence on these drowned landscapes is expected for rising seas, bury sites beneath meters of sediment, making recovery difficult. Yet indirect evidence supports the possibility isotopic studies of later human fossils show adaptation to marine foods, suggesting that knowledge of coastal foraging may extend deep into prehistory. The unresolved mystery is whether coastal refuges alone could sustain populations through the Bottleneck, or whether they functioned in tandem with inland refuges like the Rift Valley. Some models propose that scattered coastal groups maintained gene flow by moving along shorelines, potentially even using early water crossings on small channels, though direct evidence is lacking. The persistence of Acheulean tools along regions now far from the modern coast, such as at Eritrea, may hint at shoreline activity when sea level was lower, though the association remains debated. The fact remains that coastlines during glacial lows were far broader and more resource-rich than we often imagine, and these drowned landscapes may hold much of the story of human survival. The lesser-known observation is that coastal refuges could also have provided more stable microclimates, as proximity to the sea moderates temperature extremes, reducing heat stress in glacial aridity and cold. For small groups, such stability would make survival more likely even if food sources fluctuated inland. At planetary scale, the transformation of coastlines is one of the most visible consequences of glacial cycles reshaping continents and repeatedly altering the boundaries of habitability. These shifting margins illustrate how human survival is tied not just to continental interiors, but to the dynamic edge where land meets sea. The scale reference underscores this: a single glacial cycle could expose coastal plains as wide as modern nations, then drown them again within a few thousand years, leaving no trace of their human occupants. For humans of the Bottleneck, such landscapes would appear as stable lifelines within their lifetimes, even though they vanish on geological timescales. The unresolved mystery is how often humans reached these margins and whether they developed specialized strategies for marine resources so early. Later evidence shows clear reliance, but the gap between that and the Bottleneck remains one of archaeology's most difficult challenges. Yet the plausibility of coastal refugees remains high, given the combination of accessible food, moderated climates, and the scale of exposed land during glacial lows. In the broader picture, coastal survival fits within the pattern of refugia, small scattered habitats, offering continuity when the wider planet grows hostile. Just as the Rift Valley provides water and varied ecologies, inland coasts offer food and stability at the continent's edges. Together, these refuges form a mosaic that explains how fewer than 1,300 breeding individuals could persist through over 100,000 years of scarcity. Acheulean tools would have served here as inland, providing sharp edges for butchering fish, cutting reeds, or processing shellfish, continuity, once again ensuring survival. Fire, if maintained, would aid in cooking shellfish and drying fish, enhancing nutrition. Though evidence remains speculative, the scale of human survival remains fragile. Measured not in numbers but in persistence, and coastal refuges may represent one of the hidden foundations of that persistence. Though drowned and largely invisible today, these ancient shorelines remind us that survival often depends on landscapes that vanish in the geological record, leaving only indirect hints in genetic models and ecological logic. The story of human continuity through the bottleneck cannot be told without acknowledging the likely role of coasts, where the meeting of land, sea, and climate provided one of the last threads of endurance in a world of ice dryness and shifting skies. The bottleneck leaves its mark not only in genetics but also in the thinness of the archaeological and fossil record, a quiet gap sometimes called the genetic silence, when evidence of humans becomes scarce and discontinuous across continents. Between roughly 900 and 800,000 years ago, the number of fossil sites diminishes, and stone tool sequences appear fragmented with fewer datable contexts than before or after. This absence does not mean that humans vanish, for DNA shows their persistence, but it does mean that their traces are unusually faint, as though the record itself mirrors the contraction of their numbers. The fact at the heart of this section is that genetic modeling identifies a bottleneck lasting more than 100,000 years, with effective population size below 1/300, a figure that aligns with the archaeological silence of the same interval. The lesser-known detail is that while fossils from this time are rare, those that exist often fall at the edges of the bottleneck, such as the Gongwangling cranium from China, dated to around 900,000 years ago, or remains at Atapuerca in Spain, slightly later, suggesting scattered survival rather than broad occupation. Mystery lies in why the fossil and archaeological record is so incomplete, whether small populations truly left fewer artifacts, whether erosion and burial erased most traces, or whether the landscapes of survival now lie submerged beneath seas or concealed under sediment. This unresolved question reflects both human fragility and the limits of preservation, leaving scholars to piece together continuity from fragments. The archaeological gaps are mirrored by environmental records that show harsh variability. Dust accumulation. Peaks lake cores reveal repeated drying, and marine sediments show shifts in productivity, all consistent with conditions that would thin populations and limit occupation intensity. Acheulean tools remain present, but less abundant, with sites sometimes consisting of only a few scattered hand axes rather than dense accumulations. This pattern suggests smaller groups moving lightly across the landscape, leaving behind fewer signs of their presence. At planetary scale, the silence is a reminder of how human traces are dwarfed by Earth's systems, for glaciers advance and retreat with clear geological signatures, while humans leave only faint scatterings of stone and bone. The contrast highlights the vulnerability of a species that endures through the narrowest margins of visibility. The fact that later periods show denser archaeological records underscores how unusual the bottleneck interval is. It is not simply that preservation is poor everywhere, but that the scale of human activity truly contracts. The lesser-known observation is that some of the few artifacts attributed to this time show unusual wear or repeated resharpening, suggesting that tools were curated longer, a behavior consistent with scarcity of resources and low population density. The unresolved mystery is whether symbolic or cultural practices already emerging in some groups were lost during this silence erased, because small numbers could not sustain them, leaving only the conservative Aculean to carry forward. Genetic data suggests that during such a prolonged bottleneck, diversity declined sharply, and many lineages vanish completely, meaning that cultural variation would likely have contracted alongside biology. At planetary scale, Earth records this time clearly in oxygen isotope curves, where the mid-Pleistocene transition shows its full force, but humans nearly vanish as a visible presence reduced to whispers in the record. The scale reference is sobering. The bottleneck lasts over 100,000 years longer than all of recorded history, many times over, and through that span, human evidence is as thin as a few fossils and scattered stones. The silence itself becomes evidence for absence across such a broad time and space, reflects real contraction rather than chance. Archaeological efforts continue to search for sites from this interval, but each discovery remains rare and often contested. At places like Wonderwork Cave or Olorges Sali, occupation sequences may approach the bottleneck, but even these are discontinuous, leaving open the question of where most humans lived. Perhaps the answer lies in refuges that are now geologically hidden. Drowned coasts, deeply buried valleys, or eroded plains that conceal the traces of small groups who nonetheless endured. The unresolved mystery, then, is not only where they survived, but what was lost in the silence. Entire traditions of tool-making, foraging strategies, or social practices may have arisen and vanished without leaving record, swallowed by the bottleneck and the geological processes that erase evidence. At planetary scale, silence is as telling as sound. Glaciers leave moraines, oceans leave sediments, winds leave loess. But humans at their most fragile leave little behind their continuity, proven not by artifacts, but by the persistence of their descendants. The lesser-known point is that this thinness of record is not unique to humans. Other large mammals also show reduced ranges and less frequent fossils during glacial intensification, suggesting that the bottleneck reflects a broader ecological crisis. Yet humans, unlike most species, later rebound to global dominance, meaning that the silence of this period is a prelude to expansion. The fact remains that between 930,000 and 813,000 years ago, humans nearly disappear from view in both fossils and archaeology, a reflection of their reduced numbers. The silence itself becomes part of the narrative. It tells of survival so tenuous that only genetic memory preserves it, while material traces erode or vanish. At planetary scale, this silence is dwarfed by the clarity of climate records, reminding us that humans are small actors in Earth's vast system. The scale reference drives home the fragility. For more than 4,000 generations, human presence is detectable only as a faint genetic signal and a few scattered tools. This long narrowing emphasizes that continuity does not always leave visible marks, and that much of human prehistory remains hidden beneath the silences of geology and time. In the end, the genetic silence is not emptiness, but endurance, the faint echo of groups so small and scattered that they leave little behind. Yet their persistence carries forward the lineage that shapes all who come after. Although the fossil and archaeological record of the bottleneck remains fragmentary, modern human genomes carry unmistakable traces of that crisis, a record inscribed not in stone or bone, but in sequences of DNA inherited across countless generations. By comparing patterns of genetic diversity among living populations, scientists reconstruct demographic history, and in doing so, they detect the signature of an ancient severe reduction that occurred between 930,000 and 813,000 years ago. The fact here is that effective population size fell below 1/300 breeding individuals for more than 100,000 years, a duration so long that its imprint remains detectable today, despite subsequent expansions. This conclusion rests on coalescent modeling, a statistical method that estimates how far back different genetic lineages converge to common ancestors, and when applied to thousands of genomes, it reveals not only expansions but also contractions. The lesser-known detail is that the Fit-Cole method introduced in 2023 made it possible to detect this bottleneck with high resolution using mutation rates to track fine-scale population changes deep in time. Its results suggest that around 65% of ancestral genetic diversity was lost during this interval, an erasure that still shapes the variations seen in human populations worldwide. The unresolved mystery is how exactly this contraction affected different lineages of Homo. Did it impact only the ancestors of Homo sapiens, or did it also constrain the lines that led to Neanderthals and Denisovans? Some interpretations propose that the bottleneck corresponds to a speciation event when the human lineage split into separate branches, but fossils are too sparse to confirm this. At planetary scale, the genetic imprint reflects global processes, for the bottleneck aligns with the mid-Pleistocene transition, a time when ice ages lengthened and intensified, reshaping ecosystems and constraining habitats. The link between climate instability and genetic contraction illustrates the deep interdependence of Earth systems and human evolution, where orbital cycles and atmospheric carbon dioxide leave marks not only in sediments and ice cores, but also in the DNA of living species. For the few surviving humans, genes carried both loss and continuity. Certain alleles that confer advantages may have risen in frequency simply by chance in small populations, a process known as genetic drift, while others were shaped by selection under harsh conditions. The lesser-known observation is that genes involved in neurological development, reproduction, and immune function show signals of selection dating to this time, suggesting that even amid near-extinction evolution continued to shape traits that would influence later humanity. Mystery lingers around the degree of gene flow between refugees during the bottleneck. Did small groups remain almost entirely isolated, or did occasional movements connect them, preventing total fragmentation? Genetic data suggests that some exchange occurred, for if isolation had been absolute, diversity might have vanished completely. Yet the frequency and roots of such contact remain unknown, concealed by the long span of time. The planetary scale of this contraction is striking when set against other species. Bottlenecks are not uncommon in evolutionary history, but few last so long or reach numbers so low without extinction. For comparison, cheetahs underwent a severe bottleneck about 100,000 years ago, leaving them genetically uniform today. But the human bottleneck was far earlier and lasted longer, with recovery only much later. The scale reference underscores the fragility: 1/300 breeding individuals across Africa and possibly parts of Eurasia. A number smaller than the population of many modern villages, yet their descendants encompass all living humans. The genetic legacy of this event appears in patterns of reduced heterozygosity compared to what might be expected without such a bottleneck, and in the deep coalescence times of certain gene families. The fact that we can detect such an ancient demographic event at all demonstrates the power of genetic memory, a record carried silently in cells across nearly 1 million years. The lesser-known implication is that the bottleneck may explain why the human lineage shows less genetic diversity than other great apes today. Chimpanzees and gorillas maintain higher levels of variation across their populations, consistent with their larger and more continuous historical sizes, while humans, despite global spread, remain genetically more homogeneous, a reflection of deep contraction. The unresolved mystery is whether this reduced diversity limited or enhanced adaptability. Some argue that loss of variation constrained human resilience, while others suggest that selection during the bottleneck concentrated advantageous traits. The planetary context emphasizes that human evolution cannot be separated from Earth's climate history. Orbital eccentricity cycles altered glaciation patterns, ice sheets changed, albedo and carbon dioxide fluctuated sharply, all factors that reshaped habitats. These planetary shifts narrowed human numbers, and their genetic echo endures. The scale of persistence is almost unimaginable, more than 100,000 years of near extinction, during which generation after generation lived, reproduced, and died, carrying forward the fragile lineage that would eventually expand to billions. The silence of the fossil record during this time contrasts with the richness of the genetic record, reminding us that survival does not always leave visible traces, but can still be read in the hidden code of life. Genes become the archive of continuity when bones and tools are absent, and in this archive we see not only survival, but adaptation under pressure. The lesser-known detail is that some genomic segments trace coalescence times to this interval, meaning that even specific alleles in living people today may descend directly from the small pool of survivors who endured the bottleneck. The unresolved mystery is how many cultural or behavioral traits vanished with those who did not survive, for genes carry biology, but not memory of life, ways leaving only the question of what was lost in silence. Yet what endures is enough: the capacity to adapt, the continuity of stone tool traditions, and perhaps the tentative use of fire. At planetary scale, the bottleneck shows how closely human fate aligns with cycles larger than any species, cycles measured not in years or centuries, but in tens of thousands of years, driven by orbital mechanics and climate feedbacks. The scale reference closes the reflection: 300 individuals, over 117,000 years, a span longer than Homo sapiens has existed as a species. A reminder that the foundation of humanity rests on survival, through an interval when extinction seemed the more likely outcome. That survival, inscribed in DNA, links every living person today to the few who endured a chain unbroken across 1,000,000 years of planetary change. Even in the long darkness of the bottleneck, the climate offered brief interludes of relief when glaciers retreated and rainfall returned, opening landscapes that had been closed for thousands of years. These great interglacial openings, though short compared to the long glacials, allowed vegetation to expand, lakes to refill, and animal herds to spread, creating windows in which small human populations could grow, disperse, and reconnect. The fact grounding this section is that during the mid-Pleistocene transition, interglacial phases become shorter but more intense, marked by rapid warming and expansion of habitats before being followed by prolonged cold. Pollen records from lake sediments in Africa and Europe confirm these expansions, showing sudden bursts of woodland savanna or grassland vegetation that vanish just as quickly when aridity returns. The lesser-known detail is that in cores from Lake Malawi and Lake Tanganyika, shifts in diatom species indicate dramatic changes in lake depth and productivity, evidence of wet phases, when these vast basins brimmed with water, sustaining fish, birds, and shoreline vegetation that would have supported humans. For small groups scattered in refuges, these interglacials provided critical opportunities. Populations isolated for thousands of years could expand outward, occasionally encountering one another and exchanging genes, a process that may have helped maintain enough diversity to prevent extinction. The unresolved mystery is how far humans dispersed during these warm phases. Fossils and tools from sites like Atapuerca in Spain suggest occupation in Europe during interglacials. But whether these groups represent expansions from African refugees or local persistence remains debated. At planetary scale, the rhythm of interglacials is driven by orbital cycles, with peaks in insolation triggering ice retreat and carbon dioxide feedback, amplifying warming. These cycles show the tight linkage between cosmic mechanics and human opportunity. The tilt of Earth's axis and the shape of its orbit determine when ice sheets retreat indirectly, shaping the chances of survival for species living thousands of kilometers away. The scale reference is striking. Each interglacial may last only 10 to 15,000 years, a brief respite within glacial cycles lasting 80 to 90,000 years. Yet, within these narrow intervals, humans find the chance to grow and spread. Archaeological traces sometimes reflect this pattern. At sites such as Gesher Benot Yaakov in the Levant, dated to around 780,000 years ago, stone tools and burned plant remains appear in an interglacial context, suggesting that humans moved into northern regions when climates allowed. Similarly, in Europe, hominin fossils at Atapuerca demonstrate occupation during a warm phase, though whether these represent ancestors of later Neanderthals or other lineages is uncertain. These windows also appear in Africa, where paleolakes expand dramatically, creating corridors of movement through regions otherwise arid. For small populations, these expansions may have seemed like rebirth animals returning vegetation, greening rivers flowing. Yet the relief is temporary, and as orbital cycles shift again, drought returns, lakes shrink, and habitats contract. This cycle of opening and closing shapes the very rhythm of human survival during the bottleneck. The lesser-known observation is that these interglacials may have played a key role in maintaining minimal genetic exchange between groups, preventing total fragmentation. Even a handful of contacts across thousands of years could sustain enough diversity to keep the lineage viable. Mystery remains in how consistent these expansions were. Did humans move far during each interglacial, or did they simply expand locally within a few hundred kilometers? The record is too thin to resolve, leaving open whether interglacials fostered long-distance dispersal or only short-term local growth. At planetary scale, the cycle resembles a breath. Earth inhales warmth, vegetation, and animals spread, humans expand, then Earth exhales. Cold glaciers advance, deserts widen, and humans contract again. The duration of the bottleneck means that this cycle repeated several times, each interglacial offering a temporary reprieve, each glacial narrowing survival once more. The fact is that despite the severity of the bottleneck, humans never disappear completely, suggesting that these interglacial openings were sufficient to maintain continuity. The scale reference deepens perspective. A single interglacial of 10,000 years represents 400 human generations, long enough for population growth, dispersal, and cultural transmission, even if followed by contraction. Within these spans, tools continue to be made. Knowledge of landscapes is passed down, and continuity is maintained. Acheulean hand axes appear in many of these contexts, showing that even as environments expand and contract, the core technological tradition persists. Fire, where present, would have been especially valuable in colder interstadials, extending the range of human habitation, though its evidence remains patchy. The unresolved mystery is whether interglacials provided enough stability for innovation, or whether the constant cycle of expansion and contraction constrained cultural development to conservatism. Some argue that the bottleneck slowed the pace of technological change, with small populations unable to sustain cumulative advances. Others suggest that the very instability fostered resilience, teaching humans to adapt repeatedly to changing conditions. At planetary scale, the mid-Pleistocene transition locks humans into this cycle of scarcity, punctuated by brief relief, a dynamic that shapes their demographic history. The lesser-known implication is that many of the fossils we do have from this interval cluster in interglacial contexts, not glacial ones, reflecting the reality that humans left more traces when environments were favorable. Thus, the apparent silence of glacial periods may be both real, reflecting demographic collapse, and preservational, reflecting absence of occupation. Yet the fact remains, Interglacials provided windows of survival, temporary expansions that carried humanity through one of its narrowest passages. The rhythm of opening and closing landscapes defines this era, a planetary heartbeat that pulses through the genetic and archaeological record. For humans, survival means enduring the long contractions and seizing the brief expansions, a pattern repeated across more than 100,000 years. In the end, these interglacial openings represent the fragile balance between extinction and persistence, moments when small populations could breathe, recover, and pass on the lineage that would one day become our own. The survival of humans through the bottleneck cannot be understood without considering the rhythms that drive Earth's climate on planetary scales. For the contraction of populations coincides with the mid-Pleistocene transition, when orbital pacing shifts and the very cycles of ice and warmth change their tempo. These rhythms, known as Milankovitch cycles, consist of three slow movements: eccentricity, the shape of Earth's orbit varying every 100,000 years; obliquity, the tilt of Earth's axis shifting every 41,000 years; and precession, the wobble of the axis cycling every 21,000 years.